Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be exploring something a little unexpected.
Oh.
The relationship between India and Spain.
Okay.
We've got a whole bunch of stuff to look at. We've got some news summaries, some really in-depth analyses of their diplomatic relationship, and even a clip from India News.
Wow.
About a recent visit by Spain's prime minister. So
Cool.
it's more exciting than it sounds, I promise.
All right. I'm intrigued.
But the question is, why should this connection matter to you?
Yeah. Why should we care?
Let's find out.
Okay.
Well, shall we?
Yeah. Let's do it.
Okay, so first things first, what's fascinating to me right off the bat is that these two countries, both with these incredibly long histories, only officially started their diplomatic relationship in 1956.
Yeah. That's pretty recent when you think about it.
1956. That does seem super late in the game. Wait.
Well, it's a few things combined. The most obvious is just distance.
Right.
They're literally on opposite sides of the world.
Yeah.
Back in the day, that made interaction a lot harder. Then there's the whole colonial history thing. You know, Spain was focused on the Americas while India was under British rule.
Right.
And honestly, both were more concerned with their own regions and whatever their colonial powers were up to.
So their paths just didn't cross much.
Exactly. Spain was deep in Europe and Latin America.
Yeah.
India was dealing with Asia and the British Empire.
So they were both busy with their own entanglements, so to speak.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, so that makes sense. But here's where I think it gets really interesting. Despite this lack of early connection, things have really picked up since the mid-20th century.
Absolutely.
And speaking of picking up, we can't ignore the Spanish Prime Minister's visit to India recently.
Oh, yeah.
It wasn't just a quick hello. This was a big deal.
A very big deal.
So tell me why.
This visit, the first by a Spanish PM in 18 years,
Wow.
included the opening of a new Tata Airbus plant in India
Okay.
for building C-295 aircraft.
Okay.
This is significant on multiple levels, not just for these two nations, but for global defense as a whole.
Yeah. You know what stood out to me was that this is India's first privately owned military aircraft factory.
It's a huge shift.
Right. It shows this big shift in their ability to make their own defense equipment. And Spain's playing a part in that.
Yeah, and it reflects a global trend.
Oh, how so?
Alliances are shifting.
Okay.
And countries that weren't traditionally close are finding common ground, especially in areas like defense.
So how does all this affect someone who's listening to this, not negotiating international deals? What's the takeaway for our listener?
Well, it means the world's getting more interconnected. And these partnerships, they have ripple effects.
Oh.
India's growing defense industry, for example,
Right.
creates markets and opportunities both within India and for its partners like Spain.
I see.
We need to pay attention to these alliances because they're changing the geopolitical landscape. Understanding them is key in this century.
All right. So speaking of interconnectedness, let's talk money, specifically trade. The numbers here are pretty impressive. Over 7.5 billion exchanged between India and Spain just in 2023.
It's a relationship worth keeping an eye on.
Yeah. And it's not just one way either, right?
No, not at all. It's a two-way street.
Okay.
We see Spanish companies investing a lot in India.
Like what?
Renewable energy, automotive stuff, infrastructure projects.
Oh, wow.
Simultaneously, Indian companies are expanding into Spain,
Well,
particularly in IT and pharmaceuticals.
you know what's interesting to me is that focus on renewable energy. Spain's a leader in that area. And it seems like their know-how fits perfectly with India's push for cleaner energy.
It's a perfect example of how collaboration isn't just about profit, but about tackling global problems together, like climate change.
Yeah.
And for any listener interested in investment, this is an area with huge potential.
So beyond the business side of things, one thing that stood out to me in all this was the emphasis on cultural connections.
Yeah, this often gets overlooked, but it's so vital for building strong relationships.
Right.
The Spanish Prime Minister's interest in meeting Bollywood figures shows this.
Yeah, and films like Zindagi No Malagito Bora have actually boosted tourism to Spain from India.
It's true.
It's funny you mentioned that movie. I remember friends getting super interested in Spain after seeing it. Pop culture can really bridge those gaps.
It can.
But it's not just Bollywood, though, right?
No, there's potential in things like yoga and flamenco dancing, even newer stuff like music collaborations or sharing cuisines and modern art.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it's really about those human connections that then lead to the more formal things.
Exactly. These exchanges create understanding and appreciation, which are the foundation for trust and cooperation on a bigger scale.
Okay, so it's not all perfect, though, right?
Of course not.
While India and Spain seem to have a good thing going, they don't always see eye to eye on global issues.
That's true. The Russia-Ukraine conflict highlights this.
So,
Spain as part of the EU, and NATO is firmly against what Russia's doing.
right.
India, on the other hand, has remained neutral, calling for peaceful solutions and dialogue.
So another area where they differ is on the Jammu and Kashmir issue.
Yeah. Spain, aligning with the EU, wants a peaceful resolution through talks between India and Pakistan, considering the people of Kashmir on both sides.
So these differences are bound to happen in any international relationship.
It's inevitable.
But the key is how you manage them.
Exactly. And in this case, both India and Spain are committed to open talks and diplomacy. They might not agree, but they're willing to work through it.
That's an important point, acknowledging those differences and still finding ways to work together.
It's crucial.
So I'm curious, what are your thoughts? Do you see these differing viewpoints more as obstacles or as chances for constructive dialogue?
Honestly, they can be both.
Okay,
It really depends on how you approach them.
I see.
Seen as obstacles, they breed distrust, but seen as chances for dialogue, they lead to understanding and maybe even common ground.
So what's next for these two? What do you think the future holds for India and Spain?
I think the future's looking bright.
Okay, good.
There are so many areas where they can build on what they have.
Like what?
Making visas easier for travel and exchange.
Okay.
Deeper cultural understanding through education and people-to-people projects. More coordination on global issues politically. The possibilities are exciting.
And the potential benefits of an India-EU free trade agreement are huge.
They're enormous.
And Spain has been vocal about supporting India's bid for a permanent seat on the UN Security Council,
Absolutely.
which would really solidify their partnership globally.
It would be a huge sign of support.
And let's not forget their current work together in areas like renewable energy and digital technology, which are crucial for both countries' futures.
You've hit all the key points. The India-Spain story is fascinating. It shows how nations that seem very different can find common ground and build something beneficial for both.
Right.
It's often overlooked, but as we've seen, it has the potential to be a big player on the world stage.
We've gone pretty deep into this, but there's always more to explore. For anyone who's been listening and captivated by this, I encourage you to dig into specific areas of India-Spain collaboration that pique your interest.
Yeah, and as you explore,
Yes.
here's a final thought for you.
Okay, ready.
Could India and Spain, despite their distance and history, actually become major partners in shaping a multipolar world order? The potential is definitely there. That question highlights one of the most interesting things about this relationship, its potential to shake up the usual geopolitical alliances.
You're right. Going through all this, I was struck by just how many different areas India and Spain are working together in.
It's pretty remarkable.
We've talked defense trade culture, but there's also things like counterterrorism, cybersecurity, even climate change initiatives.
That's what makes it so fascinating. It's multifaceted, always changing, very dynamic. And it speaks to a bigger trend in international relations, the rise of what's called minilateralism.
Minilateralism, I haven't heard that one before.
It basically means a small group of countries cooperating often on specific issues or within a certain region.
Okay.
It's a more focused and agile way of doing diplomacy compared to the big multilateral organizations like the UN.
So instead of trying to get everyone to agree on one big thing, you have smaller groups working together on things where their interests align.
Exactly. And this is where India and Spain get even more interesting.
How so?
They're both part of the G20, the UN, and all that, but they're also forging their own path with these smaller collaborations.
It's like they're experimenting with new ways of engaging with each other in the world.
Precisely. And that's something for our listeners to consider.
Oh, what's that?
In a world that's this complex and interconnected, are the old ways of diplomacy still the best way? Or do we need these more adaptable approaches to deal with 21st century problems?
That's a great point to ponder now. Before we move on, I want to circle back to that potential India-EU free trade agreement.
Oh,
It's been in the works for a while, and if it actually happens, it could be a game changer.
it would be huge. No doubt the EU is one of India's biggest trading partners, and an FTA would get rid of tariffs, reduce barriers, make investment a lot easier.
And what's really interesting is that Spain's been a strong voice for India within the EU, pushing to get this agreement done.
They've been very vocal.
They see India not just as an economic partner, but as a strategic and cultural one, too.
They understand that a strong India is good for Europe and for the world as a whole.
Interesting.
They see India as a counterbalance to China's growing power and as a partner in promoting democracy and a rules-based world order.
So it's not just about buying and selling stuff. It's about building a better world, really.
Precisely. And that leads us to another important aspect of this relationship, their collaboration on counterterrorism.
All right, this is something both countries have had to deal with. India's been grappling with terrorism for decades, and Spain has also suffered attacks like the Madrid train bombings in 2004.
Absolutely. These shared experiences have really brought them together.
In what way?
They share intelligence, do joint training exercises, and work together on strategies to fight radicalization and extremism.
It reminds us that these global problems need global solutions. No one can fight terrorism alone. It takes cooperation, sharing information, and a united front.
And for those listening who are interested in the complexities of international security, this is worth looking into.
Oh, how so?
How do countries with different histories, cultures, and political systems find common ground to fight terrorism? What are the hurdles and opportunities in building these international alliances? These are important questions to explore.
You've given us a lot to think about, but there's one more piece of the puzzle I want to look at.
What's that?
Spain's support for India's bid for a permanent seat on the UN Security Council.
Ah, yes, this is a big deal and shows the level of trust and respect they have for each other.
How so?
Spain recognizes India's growing power, its contributions to peace and security, and its commitment to democracy.
And it's not just words. They actually advocate for India in the EU and other places.
It's true.
They understand that to make the UN Security Council reflect the 21st century, it needs to include major players like India.
And it's a long and complicated process, but Spain's support is crucial for India. It gives India's claim legitimacy and helps build the international consensus needed for such a big change.
It's a clear sign that Spain sees India as a partner, not just one-on-one, but in shaping how the world is governed.
And that brings up a question for our listeners.
Oh, what's that?
As the world becomes more multipolar, with new power centers emerging, who will have a say in how things are run? Who will shape the new world order? The India-Spain relationship suggests the answer might surprise us.
Those are some really thought-provoking points. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's come back to the here and now. Now, we've talked about grand visions of the future. But what about the day-to-day realities of this relationship? What challenges do they face, and where are the opportunities to make things even better?
That's a great question. While the future potential is exciting, we can't ignore the present, which, like any relationship, has its complexities.
Right. One thing that popped out from what we've been reading was the issue of visas.
Oh, right.
It seems like there have been some problems in the past, particularly for Indian athletes and students trying to go to Spain.
Yes. There have been a few high-profile cases where visa denials caused some tension.
Like what?
For instance, in 2022, a group of Indian wrestlers were denied visas to compete in a championship in Spain.
Oh, wow.
This caused a lot of anger in India and highlighted the need for a smoother visa process.
It's a reminder that even in the friendliest relationships, these bureaucratic hurdles can pop up. It shows how important clear communication and efficient processes are to avoid misunderstandings.
Absolutely. These visa issues, while relatively minor in the big picture, can really impact people-to-people exchanges, which are crucial for building strong ties.
So what can be done to fix this?
Well, both sides are aware of the issue and are working on streamlining things.
Okay.
This includes simplifying applications, improving communication between embassies and consulates, and maybe even looking into more flexible visa rules for certain groups like students and researchers.
That makes sense. If we want more cultural and educational exchange, we need to make it easier for people to travel between the two countries.
Exactly. And that's just one example of how practical improvements can have a big impact on the relationship.
Are there other areas where things could be improved?
Definitely. Trade is one that comes to mind.
Okay.
While bilateral trade has been growing, there's still a lot of untapped potential.
I see.
One of the main obstacles is the lack of a free trade agreement between India and the EU.
We talked about that earlier, and it seems like a key piece of the puzzle.
It is without an FTA. Indian businesses have to deal with tariffs and other barriers when they export to Spain and other EU countries.
Right.
This makes their products less competitive and limits how much trade can grow.
So having an FTA would be a win-win.
It would help businesses on both sides boost trade and strengthen economic ties.
And it's something both governments are actively working towards.
Yes, negotiations for an India-EU FTA have been going on for several years now, and there's hope they'll reach an agreement soon.
That would be a huge step forward, showing a real deepening of their economic partnership.
Absolutely. And it would make it easier for Spanish companies to invest in India, especially in areas like renewable energy infrastructure and technology.
It sounds like there's a lot of potential there with Spain's expertise aligning perfectly with India's goals for development.
Exactly. And that's what makes this partnership so promising. They're not just looking for short-term wins. They're building something based on shared values, a long-term vision, and a commitment to mutual benefit.
It's great to see a relationship that's not just about transactions, but built on genuine partnership.
I agree. And that's something for our listeners to appreciate. In a world where relationships are often defined by power and self-interest, the India-Spain partnership shows what's possible when countries choose collaboration and mutual respect.
It gives us hope in these uncertain times. Now, while we're on the topic of challenges and opportunities, I want to bring up something that often causes tension in international relations, differences in political views and how they approach global issues.
Of course, no two countries will agree on everything, and India and Spain definitely have some different viewpoints.
Right. We discussed the Russia-Ukraine conflict earlier, and that's a prime example. Spain, being part of the EU and NATO, condemned Russia's actions and imposed sanctions. India, on the other hand, took a more neutral stance, abstaining from votes against Russia at the UN and continuing to buy Russian oil.
These differences can be tricky, but it's important to remember that they don't necessarily ruin the relationship. Both countries understand they have different geopolitical considerations and historical ties.
So instead of letting those differences become problems, they've chosen to focus on where they can agree and work together.
Exactly. That's a mature and pragmatic way to handle diplomacy. They've recognized that they don't need to agree on everything to have a strong and productive partnership.
It reminds us that diplomacy is about finding common ground even when there are disagreements.
Absolutely. And it's something our listeners can apply to their own lives.
No, well,
Whether it's in personal relationships, work, or even online discussions, being able to respectfully disagree and find common ground is a valuable skill.
well said. Now, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to touch on one more area where India and Spain have sometimes had different views.
Oh, what's that?
The issue of Kashmir.
Yes. This is a complex and sensitive topic, and it's important to be nuanced. And understanding Spain as a member of the EU generally aligns with the EU's stance,
Which is
to advocate for a peaceful resolution through dialogue between India and Pakistan, respecting the people of Kashmir on both sides of the line of control.
And what about India's stance?
India considers Kashmir to be an integral part of its territory and has maintained that the issue is a bilateral matter between India and Pakistan. They've been cautious about international intervention and have emphasized the need to address terrorism and separatist movements in the region.
So they have different perspectives.
Yeah.
How has this affected the India-Spain relationship?
It's definitely a sensitive point, but it hasn't ruined their overall partnership. Both countries have shown maturity in handling the Spain while sticking to the EU's position, has also acknowledged India's concerns and engaged in dialogue to understand India's point of view.
It's a good example of how, even on sensitive issues, diplomatic engagement and listening can help manage differences.
Exactly. It highlights the importance of open communication and a nuanced understanding of each other's positions.
It's a valuable lesson for anyone involved in international relations or even dealing with complex issues in their personal or professional lives.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, we've covered a lot in this second part of our deep dive. We've looked at the challenges and opportunities where their views align and diverge, and the principles guiding this interesting partnership.
It's been fascinating so far, and I'm excited to see what comes next.
Me too. But before we wrap up this episode, we have one more important thing to discuss.
Just as that.
The future of the India-Spain relationship.
Oh, right. Of course.
What are the emerging trends, the areas ripe for collaboration, and the potential for these two nations to become even stronger partners on the world stage? We'll delve into all that and more in the final part of our deep dive.
I can't wait.
All right, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the surprisingly dynamic world of India-Spain relations. We've gone from history to trade to even Bollywood. But now for the big question, what does the future hold?
Well, what's exciting is that the potential is vast. We've already seen so much progress in just the past few decades, despite their formal ties being relatively recent.
It's like they're playing catch-up in the best way possible. But where do you see the most promising areas for growth in the years to come?
If we zoom out and look at the big picture, there are several global trends converging that create a really unique opportunity for India and Spain. First, you have the rise of Asia, with India poised to become a major economic and geopolitical powerhouse.
And on the European side, Spain is increasingly looking beyond its traditional focus on Latin America and seeking new partnerships in Asia.
Precisely. They both see the value in diversifying their relationships, both economically and strategically.
So it reduces reliance on any single partner and allows them to navigate the complexities of a multipolar world.
Exactly.
This raises an important question for our listener. How does this impact you?
Yeah, why should they care?
Well, think about it this way. A stronger India-Spain partnership means more opportunities for businesses, investors, and even individuals on both sides.
It could mean new markets opening up, more jobs being created, and more cultural exchange. For example, the potential India-EU free trade agreement we discussed could be a game changer for businesses wanting to expand their operations.
And on a more personal level, think about the possibilities for travel, education, and cultural immersion. As these ties strengthen, we can expect to see more flights, student exchange programs, and even collaborations in the arts and entertainment industries.
It goes beyond governments and businesses. It's about people connecting, learning from each other, and building bridges across continents.
Okay, so we've painted a pretty optimistic picture, but let's be realistic. Every relationship faces challenges. What are some potential roadblocks India and Spain might encounter as they try to build an even stronger partnership?
Well, one challenge we've already mentioned is the need for smoother visa processes. That's something both governments are working on, but it's an ongoing process that requires constant attention and improvement.
Makes sense. And of course, there's always the possibility of disagreements on global issues, as we saw with their different approaches to the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
That's true, but I believe the key here is communication. As long as India and Spain maintain open dialogue and a willingness to understand each other's perspectives, they can manage these differences constructively.
So it's not about pretending they agree on everything, but having the maturity to disagree respectfully and find ways to collaborate despite those differences.
Exactly. Another potential challenge is simply maintaining momentum. Building a strong partnership takes sustained effort, not just from governments, but from businesses, cultural institutions, and individuals too.
So how can they make sure this relationship doesn't lose steam?
Well, one way is to set clear goals and priorities. For instance, they could focus on strengthening collaborations in specific sectors like renewable energy or digital technology.
I like that idea, focusing on areas where there's already synergy and clear benefits for both.
Right. They could also work towards creating more formal structures for cooperation, like joint research centers or business councils.
And fostering people-to-people exchanges through cultural programs, educational partnerships, and even tourism is crucial.
Absolutely. The more people from both countries interact, learn about each other's cultures, and build personal connections, the stronger the foundation of this relationship will be.
So to sum it all up, what are the key takeaways from this deep dive? What should our listener remember about the India-Spain relationship?
Firstly, it's a relationship that often flies under the radar but is full of potential. Despite their distance and limited historical interaction, India and Spain have built a strong partnership in a relatively short time.
And this partnership is multifaceted, covering everything from defense and trade to culture and counterterrorism.
Secondly, it's a relationship driven by shared values, mutual respect, and a pragmatic approach to diplomacy. They may not agree on everything, but they're committed to working together constructively.
And lastly, it's a relationship worth paying attention to. Not just for those directly interested in India or Spain, but for anyone who wants to understand the dynamics of a changing world.
As we move towards a more multipolar world order, partnerships like this one between seemingly different nations will become increasingly important. They offer a glimpse of how collaboration, not competition, can drive progress and create a better future for everyone.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, but hopefully we've left our listener with more questions than answers, more curiosity than conclusions.
Because that's what learning is all about, sparking that desire to explore further, to delve deeper, and to discover the hidden connections that shape our world.
So, as always, we encourage you to continue exploring this fascinating relationship on your own. And who knows, maybe someday you'll be the one sharing your insights on the ever-evolving story of India and Spain. Until next time, keep diving deep.
Keep diving.